Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Y-Axis Pod. I have my friend Mert on today. Mert is the co-founder and CEO of Helius. He is also an extremely well-known advocate of the Solana ecosystem and crypto in general. So it's a pleasure and an honor to have him on the pod. Thanks for coming on, Mert.
Of course. Thanks for having me. Why is this called Y-Axis?
Because it's the growth axis.
Oh, okay.
Right.
All right. Nice.
Up and to the right, baby. Up and to the right. And also my last name is Ivor, so it's a dual entendre.
Okay, cool.
So initially, before we go into perhaps more abstract matters, I'd like to hear a little bit about Helius, this company that you've founded, that you've built up. What is it? What are you guys doing at the moment in the world?
Yeah, so the story of the company is I was on Solana pretty early, before really any explorers or data analytics sites existed. Back when people were scamming with NFTs, basically, but nobody could really see if people were scamming. And I wanted to see if I was getting scammed. And so I would write some scripts on my own time to see, okay, where are these NFTs going? How many does this guy from Twitter actually have? And generally it would be something like, this guy's talking about how the NFT is minting out super fast, but actually he's just minting them all to his own wallet. And basically he's going to dump on your face after. And so I would just reply guy people with Excel graphs, basically, that got data from the indexers I built internally. And this is also while I was at Coinbase, and I used to also do indexing for EVM there. And then I noticed that it was just, so I had the definite view that Solana would become the chain that all, or not all, but most activity would happen in something like 5 to 6 years. But I figured if the developer experience is this bad, that's just not going to be possible. And since I believed it to be much better, I basically felt that I had an obligation to fix the developer experience as much as I could. And so my university roommates and classmates, Nick and Liam, they were also at Amazon and AWS at the time, and recruited them, started Helius to basically make Solana human readable. So we would build human readable APIs. And then while we were doing that, we noticed that actually everything else below this layer also sucks. So just even getting data from the RPCs or streaming data, there wasn't even notifications for events. For example, like if you received money, you would have to build so many different tools to actually get a notification for that. And so we just kept building dev tools and then formed relationships with other devs. And then they kept complaining to us. And then we listened to their complaints and kept building more products. And then now we are the number one developer platform on Solana. And the goal is to just basically help people build better, faster, cheaper, more scalable apps in crypto.
Yeah, I can confirm that it is a great product. When I was at Backpack, we used Helius as our primary provider for everything RPC and several other things as well. So great product. I think it's helped a lot of the teams in the space. I'm glad you built it. But I'm curious to know, you were at Coinbase. It was probably a pretty comfortable job. I'm sure it was enough to make a life and feel good. What was the motivation? Did you know you were going to build a venture scale startup, or was it just because you wanted to make life better for developers that you started the company?
I had a pretty good gig at Coinbase. I would say I was one of the first Canadian hires, might have even been the first one. And I loved crypto, and this is the best crypto company. I think it probably still is, especially in the West. And I was working with very smart people. Most of those people have now quit and started their own companies, which are also very successful. So there's a big Coinbase mafia, but it was very smart people doing important work. And this was actually, I joined right before they went public. So it was a very fun time because it was this transition from startup to public company that you don't really get to see too often, I don't think, in your career. And I had some pretty comfortable equity and could definitely have done pretty well staying there. But so there's like two things that happened. One is that or maybe three things. One is that I had always wanted to start a company or a startup since, probably 10 years old. I wanted to invent things all the time. And I had a bunch of different ideas, which I think are still quite good ideas, by the way. So just for fun, one of them was, I'm obviously super into watches, but I was into them before crypto. And but also super into health. And I just thought the smartwatches were just too ugly. And so I figured you could actually just take one of the circuits on one of those Oura rings and then make it flat and then add like a little charging port, but still make it thin enough. And then you could attach it to any different luxury watch that you have. Or just any watch. And so you could turn any watch into a smartwatch and you don't have to, compromise style. I actually think that idea would still kill today. But I didn't have experience creating electric circuits and manufacturing them. Another one was like, and this is when I was like 14 or something, for online shopping. If you could just do a 3D rendering of yourself by taking a few pictures, and then you could try clothes on virtually, just stuff like this. Anyway, so I was always thinking about it. But I always figured I needed more time to work at some larger company and become super comfortable in my finances such that I wouldn't be in trouble if the company failed and things like this. And then I read 2 books. I had read them before, but I was actually rereading them. One is Skin in the Game by Taleb. And basically, if you read any Taleb, he basically just calls everybody a pussy the whole time, especially economists. And he had a few lines on there, like a monthly salary is like the most addictive drug after heroin, or along with heroin. And like basically just take risks. Like life is not about risk management, it's about risk taking. And so like the only heroes today would be the ones who take that risk with their own efforts, let's say, but not other people's, right? So that's Skin in the Game. And I also read 0 to 1 again. And in the last page, I think he says something like something or nothing, like it's up to us. And then I was like, you know what? I'm feeling pretty inspired. And then I basically just made up my mind that day to quit. And I was also super annoyed with what I was seeing on Twitter, which is to say that everybody would say something like, well, the EVM already won, Ethereum is the best, L2s are the future. And internally, I was always like, this is such a shit vision, such that this would set back the industry 5 to 10 years if there isn't a much better alternative, which already kind of exists, but just needs to be developed. And so it was a combination of those. And so I was still vesting. I had a relatively solid unlock at the time for myself, but I said, fuck this. This isn't going to be worth it if I regret it in 5-10 years. So just quit and then started raising. Nobody would fund us, and we were basically bankrolling ourselves, me, Liam, and Nick. And because Solana had no developers at this time, and so it was very hard, but finally was able to get one VC, Reciprocal Ventures, who also was a believer in basically the exact same vision that I laid out before I even set it out. And I actually met him through just shitposting on Twitter when I had like 50 followers, by the way. So very large coincidence.
A long history in shitposting, I see.
Yeah, and that was, I do love to troll on the internet. And yeah, that's it.
So as an apart, why do you think Taleb's books are so incredible and his personality is so irregular and difficult? What's your sense there? Because I think one of my favorite nonfiction books is actually The Black Swan, because that chart you have of the turkey's life. And I think it was so close to my heart because that's what it was at FTX, right? I joined this company, it was worth $700 million. At the peak, it was 33 billion. And then in one day it was zero. And so I read that book and then I saw it in real life. And I think he has these amazing insights, but he's such a disagreeable personality. What's going on there?
I think that's just a package. A lot of people that have different insights just tend to be like that. He's also, well, I have somewhat of a different perspective because he's Levantine, right? He's from that part of the world, and so am I. Like roughly the exact same part of the world. Yeah, and that's actually just a very common, let's say, stereotype for like the old uncle, the old grandpa. My grandpa was like this. He just didn't know math, but he would say it about other things. And so it's honestly just a very Middle Eastern or Levantine, Eastern Mediterranean type of grandpa type that just happens to actually know what he's talking about in most cases regarding finance and math. And so I think it's just that combination. He actually has me blocked, which is hilarious. I still think he's one of my favorite authors. But he used to write the Bitcoin black paper where he declares the death of Bitcoin. And in the post, he makes a lot of faulty assumptions about what Bitcoin is for. He basically treats it as a currency that you use for buying coffee and all this stuff. And I'm like, your view's pretty outdated here. That is not what Bitcoin is actually used for. It kind of has evolved. There's other things that now do this, which are more efficient. I have worked in these fields, like the banks and the digital payments companies. But I think I said in a pretty rough way. This was like 5-6 years ago. But yeah, I would say a lot of my tweeting style probably just comes from Taleb and Eastern Mediterranean grandpa.
Hey, you have to channel that inner genetic, I feel it. Why software engineering? What made you become a dev? Where did that come from?
Well, I didn't actually want to become a software dev. That was kind of just luck. So I wanted to do theoretical physics the whole time in university. So in the school that I went to, your first year was a general year of engineering. So you do civil engineering, chemical engineering, mechanical, software. And what I liked about software was that you could just build things and prototype them right away without these ridiculously long cycles. Because, and again, going back to skin in the game, if you can't receive feedback from what you built right away, then you're not really sure if you're building the right thing, if you're really good. It's hard to prototype, iterate, all these things. And software gives you scale, basically controlling little robot armies, but that you can get tangible results with immediately. And so that was super interesting, and those tend to be my best classes. But also, I've always been very big on math. So, I wouldn't say like a Waterloo math whiz kid, but just super interested in just writing different proofs and really understanding the theory behind, or the axioms behind, how fundamental math and physics work.
Do you think that was because you wanted to understand the world in a more deep manner, or what do you think was the impetus behind that?
Well, when I was in grade 8, my uncle bought me the book, and my uncle was, I think, he was the number one math student in Eastern Turkey for like 20 years or something crazy. Like his test scores were never beat. He bought me this book, God Created the Integers by Stephen Hawking. And I couldn't understand it, but I was trying really hard. The first chapter was like Euler and basically the fundamentals of what makes modern mathematics work, and then all these different chapters from different mathematicians. And I thought it was kind of like magic. And I was super interested, at that age at least, in just magic. And I would play Skyrim. I'd always be the mage or like in any game and stuff. And I was like, this is basically like spells. Like, you're actually writing different things that determine how things work. That's pretty cool. And all the other fields also felt very noisy to me. Like, you could just write anything in sociology and then you would get 100 or an A if you just said the right words. And it didn't feel like I was getting any close to truth. It just felt very shaky. And so I'm sure there were some other things I can't remember, but I basically went with it. I was also always pretty good at it. I got like 5th in this thing called World Math Day in the world. It was just like a super fast arithmetic competition between like all the different nations and students at that age, at least. Okay, and then so after that first year in university, I went to this very small niche program. It's called Apple Math. And it's basically a double in pure math, but also some engineering, but like a bit more advanced engineering. So like satellites, radio engineering, things like this. And that's actually where I met my co-founders, Nick and Liam. And I still wanted to do theoretical physics the whole time, basically. I was unsure exactly what kind of career I could expect from that, because that doesn't really pay. And so one year it was the year for my internship, and I actually ended up getting an internship at BlackBerry when BlackBerry was a thing. And I was on the BlackBerry cloud team, and I really enjoyed what we were doing. We were shipping things that supported, because people were still kind of using BBM at the time. And like we were building infrastructure that helps that entire process actually function. And like I would talk to my friends, they would use BBM, and I'd be like, hey, I work on that. And this was also a time where the company was going through like a restructuring. They had just brought in a new CEO, and this guy was like, we're not getting rid of the physical keyboard. That's what makes us special and all this stuff. And then like 4 weeks after, they would get rid of it and then pivot to like car software and like security software. And I think this is pretty fun. It's super chaotic, but like you could actually have some impact here. Mm-hmm. And I did that for a year. That was in Waterloo. And then when I came back, I basically just checked out of school and I said, you know what? Fuck all this academic stuff. I'm just going to focus on trying to ship things and making some sort of a tangible impact. And so, yeah.
And from college, was Coinbase the first full-time job you took, or did you have a different trajectory?
No. I knew I wanted to work in finance and payments and things like this. So I worked at, or cybersecurity. It was some mix of those. So I worked as like a cybersecurity engineer
like crypto.
At Bank of Montreal. So Canada has 5 big banks. I worked at 3 of them: BMO, Scotiabank, TD. And banks are just extremely shit places to work at. Just super slow, super bureaucratic. I didn't even show up for like 5 days once, and I don't think anybody noticed. And I was like, this is a joke. And so I quit that, joined a startup. That startup got acquired. So then I joined another startup called Clearbank, which was, at the time, I believe it was the only or one of 2 only unicorns startups in Canada. And so it was a super fun environment.
It was one of the early neobanks, right? Sounds familiar, clear. Yeah.
It had some neobank stuff, but their thing was like the 15-second term sheet where you could just upload like your Shopify businesses or whatever businesses numbers, and then you get a term sheet right away, automatically. Dilution-free funding. And I built payment systems there, treasury cards, things like this. And then I was like, okay, this is better, but this financial system is also extremely inefficient. And there's so many different problems with just working with money and just world commerce. And I was already playing around with crypto on my own by that time for a while now. And it was actually between Kraken and Coinbase. I was interviewing at both. But I had read a blog post by Brian at the time where the word builder wasn't really around back then. I don't think he coined it, but he definitely popularized it at that time. And, you know, he'd say something like Coinbase is for builders. And then he like laid out his vision and like who should work here, who should not. And I was like, this is pretty sweet. I'd want to work with that guy. And so I accepted Coinbase.
What are some of the most interesting aspects of a company going from startup to publicly listed company? What are the things that stood out to you?
Well, certainly what ended up happening was, to increase their scale, they needed to hire pretty aggressively. Mm-hmm. But the people that they ended up hiring were not in crypto. But then the people who would come in, I don't think they had really good crypto education infrastructure, let's say. So basically what you would have is a lot of Web2 engineers, generally from something like Lyft or Uber, and they would be working on crypto. But then as the largest crypto company, you have a big say in what happens to the crypto industry. But the people actually working on it were not crypto natives at that point. And so what would happen is the crypto natives within the company would quit and start their own companies. And so there's a lot of successful Coinbase companies. So for example, Zora is one, right? Farcaster. I'll put Helius on there as well. But there's a bunch. And so that I think was quite interesting, because I would say it demoralized early employees that were crypto native and who weren't really motivated by money. Because at that point, you know, people who joined super early were extremely rich. And it also, so that was like I think it taught me a lot of lessons about hiring that I now try to use at Helius, about how to expand the team properly and, you know, what kind of people you actually want to look for as opposed to just a pure resume. I think company morale gets like as you hire these people, but then like Coinbase is a very visible company. And so Coinbase would have these outages a lot at the time. There would be, Coinbase app is down again, all this stuff. And then people from the outside or people from the inside would find tweets of people, saying shit things about Coinbase, and then it would like demoralize the company. And like, it really, what it taught me, I guess, was something like the culture needs to be set not from the top down, but from the bottom up, where other employees basically have to check you because it can't just be the manager doing it. And like there needs to be some mutual understanding that everybody has the same vision or some aligned vision, where, if somebody says something like, oh, well, Coinbase sucks, like, hey, how come we're doing this? A manager can just come in and be like, oh, well, we're going to do fine, we're going to do well, whatever. But if it's other employees that say that, that has a much bigger effect.
Yeah, it's so much more real.
Yeah. And so I would say those, and then, I don't know, there's a bunch of small things I could probably nitpick, but those are the big ones.
Mm-hmm. This is actually a really good backdrop for understanding Brian's letter in 2021, where he made that open statement saying who should work at Coinbase and who shouldn't, and the people that didn't want to could just leave. That this actually makes a lot of sense on why the culture got to where it is. So I find that a really interesting anecdote. You touched on hiring there. I was going to go into company stuff a little bit later, but I think it's actually a good segue. I'd love to hear how you think about organizational growth and structuring and how you've applied those things to Helius. Because when I first started working with you guys when I was at Backpack, it was just a few of you. It's grown a lot. How many people do you have now?
Just over 30.
Yeah, it's like a lot larger than it was back then. How have you applied sort of the things you've learned from your prior jobs from Coinbase to the way you've built Helius?
So the way I approach this, I don't think it's the correct way, but it's just the way that I prefer. And it's the same thing as, how they say you're supposed to build a product for yourself, like you should be your own user. And that was obviously the case with Helius because I was actually building these things before Helius. But I actually hire that way as well. So I hire people and then I let them work the way I would want to work, which is to say I don't want some, extremely process-oriented person standing on top of me at all times and giving me no freedom or always kind of giving me these top-down orders. I really don't like having a boss, and I don't want my employees to feel like they have bosses. The way I think of it is something like decentralized command, where I want to hire, but then train people to learn how to take command of their own functions, such that, it's kind of like a military thing where like, the general is not going to go and, micromanage, what kind of ammo are you guys using and all this stuff. What you do is you have a bunch of different functions. So, you have the developer relations function, the engineering function, the BD function, and Tolly says this too, and you need to find people who are just better than you at those things and then get out of their way. Now, you don't want to completely get out of the way because then you end up getting into like manager mode versus founder mode problems. And so you need to identify, and this is what I meant by the resume hiring thing a few minutes ago. If you hire purely based on resume, they might have the hard skills, like, okay, I've scaled MongoDB before to, 100 million requests per second or something. That's all great. However, do they also have the attitude and the aptitude, right? So there's like a saying, it's like, is it skill or is it will? And everybody focuses on the skill part, but the will part I find is just as important, if not more important.
If not more, yeah.
Yeah. Like a few of the people we've hired. So for example, we have a guy named Dimitri. Okay. This was a kid from Estonia, like an actual kid. And he would just be on our Discord. He didn't even know how to code. And he'd just be on our Discord, and he learned how to code by being on our Discord and using some AI. And within like 6-7 months of being on our Discord all the time, he was extremely good, and he would help other people on our Discord before I would get to them. And then I was like, and like he has no formal background or anything, just a totally random guy from Estonia, whatever. I was like, do you want to actually like get paid for this? Like, and just join us? And he did. And now this guy, I mean, he handles every single customer query ASAP. He doesn't even sleep. It's like an absolute beast. This is not somebody I would have been able to source from like LinkedIn or something like this. And we have a bunch of hires like this. One of our engineers is a guy, is a kid from Italy who would just spam me like all the time for like weeks on Twitter DMs. And then I was like, okay, like that's a lot of passion. That's a lot of energy. Let's give this a shot. Same with, we have another DevRel, Owen. So like these people, I would see them basically doing the job already out in the wild, but I think they were like overlooked, or maybe they didn't have the polished, credentials and stuff. And I actually really like finding those types of people. It's kind of like investing, where you want to like just buy low, and like find super talented people before they're discovered, but then train them such that they become kind of their own leaders and commanders within the organization. And yeah, that's roughly, because you need, especially in a remote setting, you're not going to be able to watch these people. Like in an office setting, you can kind of see what people are doing, and in some way at least. In a remote setting, absolutely not. You have no idea what they're doing, really. You're not going to put in like some draconian software watching what they do or anything. You need to just have high trust. And the way to have high trust is that you understand how they think about the world, and you understand their will and their aptitude and their attitude towards everything. And I find, especially for remote hiring, that's the most important part.
I completely agree. I mean, the best hires I've made in my career have been very similar folks to what you've described. I was one of those people too. I got my first crypto job through a Twitter DM. So I always tell companies that I advise to not overlook the very passionate, young, smart people, because they can turn out to be great. I think one thing that a lot of companies are afraid of is the upskilling or the time it takes to get those people up to speed. But I think it can be worth it if you have the bandwidth to be able to do that. And I think, how do you think about this when you balance it against the hard skill aspect? I mean, are there just roles where you have to have people that have the exact skills, or you can bend this to any sort of role?
Yeah, so that's definitely the biggest challenge. There's kind of a dichotomy versus upskilling the young people versus already hiring the skilled ones. But then the young people's skills compound because they learn these things within the context of the company. So like they learn the company systems versus, let's say, the older people, they already know the things, but they can leave and then really hurt the company, and you can't really compound them as much. And so I actually find they take similar amounts of training to get used to how the company operates. Certainly though, like it really depends on the domain. We're a highly technical company. Like we have to know Solana better than roughly anybody, something like Onza level, but for the RPC layer. And that part, there's a lot of pain there, because you can't expect people to just get good at that. Like that takes many years of hard work. And so that's about the founding team. So like me, Nick, and Liam are all engineers, and I knew how Solana worked to some extent. They didn't. They had no idea. But they're the founders. Mm-hmm. And so these guys ate shit for months, probably years, and just probably lost a few years off their lives learning this stuff. But like, it's a startup. People always want these perfect pieces to fit in. Like, I've got this super highly skilled guy who does the exact thing that he was born to do, and that he has done at Google and Mongo and Postgres and stuff. That's just not really going to happen at that stage. Like when you're super early, it could, but you'd probably have to give them co-founder equity anyways, or something pretty high. Mm-hmm. And so I actually find that it's much more important as a startup at that stage everybody thinks it's about product and product-led growth or sales-led growth and things like this. And that's true to an extent, obviously. But I actually think team-led growth is this interesting concept. I've never really heard anybody talk about it, but that's roughly how I think about it, which is to say, like if you have Michael Jordan on the team, you can just give the ball to Michael Jordan and let him run with it, but that's going to not work at some point, which is what happened to the Bulls. And so they brought in Phil Jackson, and they brought in Scottie Pippen, Dennis Rodman, and like the triangle offense. And so once you have a team, you can actually use that team's aspects, like their strengths, to form new strategies, right? Like if you have people, like if you just randomly have a world-class designer, but you're an infrastructure company, let's say, well, you could do something interesting, like actually some good intersection of this, some good combination of this is something like an Explorer or like analytics or something like this. And so
which you guys are building, right? You have an Explorer at Helius?
Yes, we're building.
What's it called?
one.
What's the website?
Orb. It's orb.helius.dev. It's not done yet. It's really just a sales demo to see like how the infrastructure works. But basically my point is, I think it's a very interesting concept to actually have a team and like just hire the smartest people you know. Like talent as they're found, not as needed. And then see what you can do with that group of people that's still within the company's vision, right? I mean, it can't be obviously completely random. Like you can't just do, I don't know, a Shopify store for t-shirts or something. But like if they're smart people and they have potential and they're passionate, and I think Y Combinator does something like this too, where they focus a lot on the founders, and then those founders often just end up having completely different ideas. And I think that's actually what's important, which is that you want the ingredients, the active ingredients, let's say in the chemical equation, to be super smart people, and then play to their skills, right? Like we're not going to build EVM RPCs, for example, even though we're an RPC company, because we just haven't done EVM. We don't know it. We haven't. It's not in our tool set. But we could do many more different focused things based on the skill sets that we have within the company.
So Helius is a very remote first company, which is my understanding. I think you denoted one pillar that makes that work, which is just people that have the will and the skill set to do the work that they need to do without having someone over their shoulder. Are there other aspects that have allowed it to work in that way? Because there are remote first companies that are successful, but it does seem to be a little bit counterintuitive in today's day and age.
Yeah, it's very difficult. And I think being a self-starter and having this ownership mentality is extremely important. And it's also extremely rare. So I would say most hires don't fit into that category. And so you need to have a screening process in place for that. And then two is going to be, and probably the most important, is you need to have an extremely strong written culture. A very, very strong writing culture. So for example, I have roughly screened everybody based on their writing ability so far, which sounds weird because, an engineer doesn't really write that much. DevRel kind of does, BD does and stuff, but not that much. I mean, mostly they're on calls or writing code or something like this. But I actually screen strongly for extremely strong communications and writing, because fundamentally that's the API for humans, let's say. Right? With computers, you just write some code and talk to them and get them to do what you want. With humans, you need to be good at writing the written word. And there's some structural things that you can put in place for that. So like some writing rules, always add a TLDR, take out all this, shit fluffy words. Don't say this, don't say that. Don't use weasel words, all this stuff. Amazon, Stripe, whatever, they wrote the book on this. They have a bunch of examples. But I like writing a lot in the form of Twitter, but also blogging. And so if you set that example from the top where you're always writing, but then, so like everybody high up in the company is always writing, and then you can kind of study them and then maybe incorporate into your own style. I think that's the most important part. And then of course there's the physics of it where you need to make the time zones work, right? If everybody is remote, but everybody is in the same part of the world, that's kind of weird, because it's not really async at that moment. So what you want with remote is you want people to communicate with each other actually as little as possible. This is also counterintuitive. I think it's something that Jeff Bezos actually said a while ago that I copied, which is that, people think that a great functional organization means everybody's communicating all the time and very actively and all this stuff. But actually, you want them to communicate as little as possible, because they shouldn't even need to, right? It's kind of like Solana with proof of history, where you don't want the nodes to just talk to each other just to know when it's their turn. They should just know it's their turn from the internal proof of history ticks, right? Very, rough example, but if they know where they're going, if they have a clear vision for that team and everything, and if they're blocked, they can just kind of like spin off like an async thread and then just wait for that, or not wait for that, but like use that as, this will be filled in later, and then keep doing their own things. That's really what you want, in my view. I think there's still a lot of downsides to remote work. Like, for example, I don't think morale is great at all times. Sometimes it is because, you can hype people up over the internet, especially in crypto where there's always volatility and news happening. But I think people will feel isolated at some point. And so that's a very hard one to figure out. And I'm not sure we've figured it out completely.
You mentioned AI, and I'm curious how much it's become a part of workflows within Helius. Is it a lot? Is it a little bit? How are you thinking about it? Is there a company level mandate with it? Is it at an individual level?
So I basically said a few months ago, a pretty long time ago actually, that like everybody should have a ChatGPT plan, like we'll pay for it, and just use this to bounce ideas off. And then like Cursor came out, and then we bought obviously the Cursor team plan. And so everybody uses, Cursor, ChatGPT, we got Claude as well. And then things like Grammarly, which I have mixed opinions on Grammarly, but I think it roughly works, or at least is better than nothing. I mean, I don't know. I don't supervise how people use AI, but obviously engineers use it for coding. I use it for many different reasons. Like anything from generating random images to, there's like a deep research function on ChatGPT now where I will say something like, okay, look at the pricing models of Cloudflare, Vercel, DigitalOcean, all these other different companies, find what they all have in common, contrast this to like how I could approach pricing on our own suite of shit. And like, so just random brainstorming, like instead of just asking like some research assistant or assistants, it just helps me bounce ideas off. But I like, for example, I would never use it for writing. I think it's extremely obvious when people use AI to write. And a lot of job interviews, like people, because one of the interview steps is like writing me a piece of content that you would publish as a DevRel, for example. And I can always tell. It's just so obvious. So I think it's a good tool for sparring, like let's say mental sparring. And then obviously mechanics of coding and stuff. And that's what mainly we use it for.
What are the tells for you when you, I have my own, but I'm curious for you when you read AI generated text, are there some very obvious tells, or is it just like a gut intrinsic feeling after having read enough sort of human generated words?
Yeah, I think it's a mix. I think it's pretty obvious from some word choices. They kind of always say
delve. They love delve.
Yeah, and like revolutionary and things like this, just words that I know these people would not use. Like I think somebody said something like there's like a large loom larking over like some limelight, and I was like, what the fuck? I was like, I don't even know half those words. And like the flow, I think you can change the words to be a bit more random, but I don't think the flow you can change too much. Like the flow ends up being kind of the same, and then at the end it'll be like, if it's like a sarcastic reply guy robot, it would just be like, it'll kind of like ask like a snarky question, like, I guess that's what we get, right? Or something like this. Like you can always kind of tell. But then again, there's also some bias here because I obviously can't remember the ones that I couldn't tell, which actually would have been AI, right? So I do have that blind side, where I can't even tell maybe if it is or if it's not.
So before we jump into some Solana stuff that I want to ask you your thoughts on and have you explain some of the technicalities you had around culture being formed from the bottom up. And I'd love to know a little bit in practice, how is that implemented? Is it just through hiring the right kind of people and sharing the mission, or is there something else there?
Certainly, you need to hire the right people. Like otherwise, it's basically like you're trying to upload Windows software to a Mac computer. It's just not going to work. Like there needs to be some alignments between the hardware and software, which is to say that employees' philosophy and, you know, their mindset with how the company actually functions. Like if there's somebody who really, really, really values a certain thing, let's say like doing the 9 to 5, it's a startup. It's just not going to work. Like I'm not going to be able to change your mind on that. And so you should just not join. And like we tell that up front. But then, you know, there's a good book on this. What You Do Is Who You Are by Ben Horowitz, which is basically all about culture. And culture is basically just what you tolerate and what you do every single day. So like, for example, if I'm saying that the culture should be, let's say as an example, extremely respectful, but then I just insult everybody on Slack all the time, I'm not doing what we said. And so that's just not going to stick. That's not going to be a part of the culture. And so it's really like what you're doing, especially the founders, but like anybody that's visible or within leadership, what they do on a regular basis, such that when they're not around, you know that the same things will happen. So, for example, if I add a TLDR to every single message, that's over, let's say 2 sentences, or like over a paragraph. If I add a TLDR to every single message, and then Nick and Liam do the same, and then we also call out when others don't do it, it's like what you do is who you are. So like now we have this is a very small part, but it's like now that's part of the culture. Like you're expected to actually write this every single time, even when nobody's watching, because it's just the norm now. So it's basically just like you need to lead by example. I think that's like the best way to describe culture. Like the culture just becomes what you just do day in and out. I think a lot of people get this wrong in that they like have some aspirational things of what they would like, you know, they'll say this will be our culture, but then you don't actually do any of those things in a day to day. And so like, it's just totally disconnected. I think you can make small tweaks on the things that are like aspirational. So something like, you know, don't use these words when you're writing, you know, like always use numbers instead of the ridiculous subjective measures. Like this project is going to take a while. Okay. What is that? Is that 3 weeks? Is that 2 weeks? Like always quantify it. Like, so you can set aspirational goals like that because people will just forget that. Like everybody's so used to using subjective measures in language. So like everybody will just forget. But that's like an achievable thing that's aspirational versus if it's something like, I don't know, get 15 code reviews for every single thing. It's just not going to happen. Especially if the CTO just YOLOs code into prod, that's just not going to happen, right? So it's certainly number one about, first of all, getting the right people who have the right hardware and software to begin with that are compatible. And that's the most important part. And then 2 is going to be actually being consistent and authentic in your actions of how you portray that culture.
I think the TLDR point is actually an important one because you sort of force everyone to make sure they have a point in what they're writing if they're going to be wasting or using everyone's time to read whatever it is they're writing. And it sort of leads me into a new question around writing itself. I think you are very well known for posting a lot, but it's not just posts that don't hit someone's heart because it gets a lot of engagement, it gets a lot of attention. What is the thing that has allowed you to write in that manner, to do things that are able to generate emotions, feeling, replies, engagement from others? TLDR, how did you learn to write as you write?
I'm not quite sure why I get so much engagement, to be honest, because before I would write very informational, educational things, and that was mostly what I did. And then I think it's really just, this is going to be a non-answer, but I actually think it's the correct one, which is taste. I think basically it's also kind of like playing sports or like picking up a skill. As you do something over and over and over and over again, your mind basically has these weights that train you to be like, this will work, this will not work, right? It's kind of your instincts. People call it, you know, your gut, your unconscious or whatever. But people always ignore that for some reason, which I think is super stupid. Like, I would say roughly that's much more powerful tool than your actual brain, or let's say your conscious brain, because the unconscious like is training all the time and is developed over a very long period of time. And that's just, so it's taste. Like when you look at, like, I don't actually deliberately think, and I actually find my worst pieces are when I deliberately think about what I'm writing and like just think too much. So like if I'm like, I must write something right now, and then I open up Twitter and then I'm like, okay, what could I say? Whatever. It doesn't really work. But if I'm just consuming information all the time, like quality information, and I'm just kind of doing things as they come to me, like, you know, I'm doing this podcast. After this, I'll check some Slack messages, listen to some music, look at some emails, whatever, go on Twitter. And then at one of those points, I will observe something that becomes an idea, and then I'll be able to poke that idea around and then reshape it in some format. And then I'll just post it because I think it's interesting. So, and I say this is probably my tip when writing. I would not think, there's a few different types of writing, but for the most part, I would not think about creating something when you're writing. I would reframe that to observing things, and then, but putting your own vocabulary, your own authentic, let's say, understanding of what you just observed into the written word. Once you do that, you can kind of see where the gaps in your thinking are, and then you can structure it to be more coherent, and it actually looks like somebody actually thought about this. But ironically, overthinking, so maybe the answer is something like, how did I get good at writing? Is I stopped thinking. Maybe I stopped thinking. I relied much more on instinct.
Yeah, I actually think that's a good answer. I don't think it's trite at all. And I think it brings up a good point around just relying on your instinct or on your unconscious or on this sort of this thing that is just there with you all the time. I want to ask you about Solana, Mert. You've truly tied yourself to the hip to this ecosystem. It is the basis of the company you're building, of your public persona, of so much that you do. And my question is why? Why is this the blockchain? Why is this the technology that you feel the confidence to be able to do that with?
Well, so a few years ago, let's say 5 years ago now, I had done the work of really looking at all the different blockchain ecosystems. Not just Ethereum and Bitcoin, but I looked at basically all of them: Polkadot, Algorand. I think I even looked at Cardano and L2, state channels, all these different things, Avalanche. And when I looked at how Solana was designed, it had a lot of contrarian but obvious insights. Something, and Tolly would do a pretty good job of articulating those. So something like, he would use his experience writing software for phones or firmware for phones back in the day, and he would say something like, well, by the time I finish writing the software, the hardware is already improved and I need to rewrite the software. And so you apply the context of blockchains, and it's like, that's correct. This is a decentralized system. And so if you don't write the software in that way, then you're going to have to keep upgrading the software at all times. And as the network gets more decentralized over time, that's never going to scale. You're not going to be able to keep updating the network all the time. The only other alternative is something like Bitcoin, where you accidentally have like a really interesting but simple, good system, such that it just doesn't require updates. But that's just Bitcoin. If you want to be a smart contract platform that's, let's say, the basis of finance, that's never going to work. And it's also, Solana is engineered a lot like a giant radio, like a giant communication system, which if you think back to the earlier in the episode, that's what I majored in, and also my co-founders. And so the concepts from the physics perspective, right? It's always about physics to me. The physics of it makes sense. Now, they're not perfect. And that's precisely why you need to tie yourself to the hip, because it's not perfect, but you can make an impact and actually help improve those things until they are better. And because, like, what's the alternative? The alternative is, well, one, you either start your own chain, which, you know, we could do, but Solana's already done all this hard work of bootstrapping ecosystem, all these different partners and community and all this stuff. It has a history. it's not perfect, but it's good enough. I mean, certainly not perfect. Obviously, you have TX happen and stuff, but like none of these are fatal terminal flaws. And then the other alternative is working on just a different ecosystem. Well, I'm obviously not going to do that if I don't think the physics of it makes sense. Like I just, the L2 thing never made sense to me for a bunch of different reasons. I think it makes sense in certain regards, but like I think those certain regards don't have an ambitious enough vision for me to actually feel comfortable tying my life to it, right? Like it needs to be pretty grand and something pretty difficult / impossible to achieve, right? Let's say all of finance on one giant computer. That's very bold, ambitious, roughly impossible. And so that's precisely why it's fun to work on, because like if you can do that, then you've done something with your life. And so it's very important that if the physics work, if there's some let's say rough diamond there, well then you as somebody with agency can help actually shape that diamond and really kind of start building out the foundation such that it just keeps improving. And that's really been, and this is why I don't just do Helius. Like obviously the developer experience needs to get better. And all that stuff, the technicals, but there's also, I do a lot of marketing stuff for Solana, right? Like only possible on Solana came from just me shouting it on Twitter all the time and in private chats. Increased bandwidth, reduced latency, for example, was a thing that Tolly said like 4 years ago. But like, I was like, this actually needs to be memed into existence. Like somebody needs to actually just keep saying this because it's important to have some aligning slogan, let's say. It's sort of like as a coach, like you have a team of like athletic kids who are like smart in their own ways and have their own talents, but you kind of have to shape them. That's much more interesting to me than like starting from scratch and then or like just trying to take over another team just because that team pays you more or something. I think the payoff function at the very end, not in just terms of monetary value, but like meaning value, is just greater.
Yeah, and I really like that framing, because what's the point if you're not finding meaning in what you're doing? It's just going to go around in circles and end up unhappy and unsatisfied with the work that you've done. If you've ran into a really cracked engineer, maybe with a physics background, somebody who is really smart that you respect, what is your pitch to nerd snipe them on Solana? How do you describe this to them?
I've learned to always make this very individual, where I won't say anything generic that I think they might like. I'll actually just ask questions on what kinds of things they're interested in. So, you know, if it's a physics kid who's interested in, I don't know, cars or something, I'll ask more questions about that, like why are you interested in cars? And perhaps, you know, the answer is something like, well, you know, maybe it's something super simple, like I like going faster. I just like fast machines. Or maybe it's something a bit more complex where it's like, because with a car, like everything holistically needs to work together. Like it can't just be the engine that's strong, but the tires, the aerodynamics, the weight, it needs to all come in nicely. And then from there, I can see if it makes sense for Solana. And then I can kind of, you know, I can be like with Solana, you know, we call it an integrated system instead of monolithic, because integrated means that all the parts together have to function extremely well. And then when it doesn't, you find the bottleneck and then you fix the bottleneck. And then you just, it's like a one giant digital car, let's say, that you're just continuously optimizing, but that everybody's driving all the time. So it has like impact. Versus if they just say something like, I like writing Rust, which is actually a very common answer. It's like, okay, well, you're not going to write Rust that's more impactful at scale anywhere other than here, right? Like, so it needs to be tailored to the person.
That makes sense. I guess what I'm trying to get out of you is a little bit of a description on how Solana works in comparison to other blockchains, or what makes it unique, what allows it to go fast and be cheap.
It depends on maybe the comparison, but roughly the design philosophy is, well, Tolly says blockchain at NASDAQ speed, but really what he's trying to say is, I mean, a blockchain fundamentally is a bunch of different computers agreeing on what the computer said and then reaching consensus on that, right? Without any one computer having authority over what the others think. put differently, in Solana's case, basically what you want, or what the way it works, or the way it should work, is it's a bunch of computers that act at the performance of one computer. And everything is designed around this philosophy. So another way of saying it is write the software to get out of the way of the hardware. So a lot of times, especially in modern software development, and this is more of a societal phenomenon, let's say, but like everything is becoming more and more abstracted at all times. Like it's just abstractions on top of abstractions, and you always lose details. Well, every abstraction that you add in software is somewhat of a hit on performance, because that abstraction has some overhead. Otherwise, it wouldn't be an abstraction. Like all abstractions have leaks, let's say, right? And Solana basically says, we need to write the software in such a way that we can actually, it's not about using like data center level equipment or something. It's actually about getting the most juice possible out of the existing resources you already have. So it's kind of like if a blockchain, if you were to compare it to cars, it's like you have all these cars that are capable, in theory, of going at 200 kilometers an hour, but they're all just going at 50 kilometers an hour. That's because the people who designed let's say the control panel of the car, the dashboard, you actually just cannot go over that because of all the other shitty parts of the car. And so Solana, the way it achieves performance is basically write software to get out of the way of the hardware. So it says, okay, modern hardware has all these different, in the internet, by the way, right? Bandwidth, that's where increased bandwidth comes from, has all these interesting things, and they're always kind of improving. And what if we could get to a state where the software we write is just squeezing all the juice possible out of the hardware that it's on? And if you get to that point, then at some point there's like a finite limit, obviously, like there's only so much physics can do.
Right?
Yeah. But then it's the economics of the chain are such that if you have that much demand to begin with, well, as a validator, you're making, let's say, a few million. You take that money, you buy a new RAM stick, and then now you have kept up with the demand, right? Very simple concept. It's so simple that everybody just thinks it's stupid. And it is kind of stupid. But like, that is how scaling works. Now, people think of it in different terms, where they think of just adding a new database and they call this horizontal scaling. And like, sure, yeah, that's one way you can do it. But this is another way you can do it as well. People will say something like, well, it's unrealistic that one computer can handle all the world's demand, but they're never able to actually quantify what this demand means, or they're extremely vague about it, right? Like we had the president of the United States of America launch a shitcoin. That's a lot of demand. Okay, so now maybe you add like all the different payments providers and stuff, and you end up getting like a more realistic number. Let's say it's like 100K TPS. But then people will use like some other argument, like, well, what if it's like 1 billion TPS in the future? It's like, well, like we'll get there when we get there. You don't build a startup for your billionth user, right?
You also don't bet against something because of some like asteroid that's going to hit in maybe 100 years or something like that. I think that's a really good point. I'd love to go into a few questions from Twitter. I usually never do this, but you're just so loved on Twitter that I thought I would ask the world what they would like to ask you. All right. Okay, here's a serious one before we go into some of the funnier ones. How do you think about the value that posting very often creates? How do you weigh that opportunity cost versus doing other things?
I don't personally think of it that way. I don't think I'm creating value by posting, and so it's more like posting takes me very little time. So there's a big misconception that I must spend like 10 hours on Twitter because I post a lot. But like, okay, let's say you make, 20 tweets a day. I mean, how much time do you think those tweets actually take? Like some of them take 5 seconds. Some of them might take like 2 minutes. And then maybe scrolling is like, an hour a day or something. But it's really not that much. Which it seems like it would be much, because when you look at the timeline, you see the engagement and you're like, oh, this person's all over the place. But it's like, that's like I mean, I write like 500,000 Slack messages per day, right? I jump on like 10, 12 calls a day. And then I also do the tweets. And so I don't view it as opportunity cost. I think it'd be opportunity cost if I like deliberately went on Twitter, and then I like try to think of things to say. Mm-hmm. But if I'm already working and then I'm like, oh, and then I just go on Twitter and then just write it out, it's kind of just like, I don't even really notice it. That being said, like you can definitely get to a place where you're addicted, and like it's actually just counterproductive. But the way it works is that the company is like a baby, and it's like constantly crying, and like you're not gonna be able to sleep if you hear crying all the time. And so like,
is it a tokenized baby or a non-tokenized baby?
So like I don't even have time to worry about opportunity costs because something from the company will pop up anyways. Mm-hmm. Like I already have, I don't know, 36, 37, 187, like 300-400 unread messages that I have to get through after this podcast. So I just don't think of it that way. And I would encourage, right? So like when you reframe your mind from creating to observing, then like as a human, you're observing things all the time regardless. So you don't have to think about doing anything too extra.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good answer. Do you have a morning routine?
Oh no,
Pop a Zin, baby. Not. No, no morning routine. Just the Zin, right? When does the first Zin hit the mouth?
Oh man, it depends on the sleep, honestly. If I had a really bad sleep, ASAP. Mm-hmm. If I had a really good sleep, also probably ASAP, but not in really a rush. Like I don't even remember to sometimes because I take a pretty low dosage. Mm-hmm. But I absolutely hate the concept of morning routines. I tweeted about this a while ago. I think a morning routine for me personally just totally rapes my creativity. Like if I'm going to do things such that my brain and instinct have no place to improvise, well then, I don't know. I just feel super bored. So I hate the concept. Like obviously there's certain things I'll do, like make tea. I'm in Dubai, so I'll try to go for a walk in the morning, get some sun so that I'm not so, and this is a new addition because my girlfriend's like, oh, you're super fucking pale. You look unhealthy. You look like you're dying. So I'm like, okay, fine. I'll go for a walk in the morning or something. But yeah.
Do you think there's a fix to the incentive problem that launching tokens creates for teams?
Oh yeah, that's a good one. So some background is everybody thinks that the problems in crypto are, something like, well, there's no apps or the infrastructure doesn't scale or it's regulatory. And there's always these like different answers that you'll get. But actually, I'm quite certain, and I've written about this a bunch of times, it's actually the problem of incentives, where when you have instant short-term incentives that make you rich right away, and even if they make you rich, but that's not even the worst part, because the worst part is now there's long-term builders who then see this guy in his private jet and they're like, what the fuck? I created much more value than this person. How come I don't have money? And so what you end up needing are like, I mean, in startups in general, you need extremely missionary type people who are just kind of crazy and very long-term oriented and able to grind through pain for at least 5-10 years. That's already super hard. Like 99% of startups already fail. But then now in crypto, you make that like an order of magnitude harder. And so then people are surprised when there's no good apps or startups or something, or there's little of them. Well, it's because of the incentives. And so I think, I don't know, it's somewhat circumstantial probably, but certainly there needs to be both a bottoms up and a top down approach, where bottoms up approach is something like the community and like the immune system of the industry evolves to be like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, and just calling people out. I mean, currently it's like Zach, XBT, and like 3 other guys kind of that do it. Like I try to do it sometimes, but like, I'm not perfect either. But there needs to be some like social cultural norms to say like, this is just sketchy. And like, it doesn't have to just be like, oh, it's a celebrity coin, but something like, how come you're going public in 4 months at 100K ARR? Like, what? Like, if you look at the comparable on NASDAQ, you need at least 100 million ARR, for example. And maybe it's actually like, there's no correct answer. Maybe like going public at 100K ARR is fine. But like, changes at that level, like structural, societal, cultural level, take a very long time. And so time might just be what you need as the fix. I think there's also just the obvious ones where you don't get blinded by greed, right? Like, I've had people approach me with like, hey, Mert, we're doing an angel round. This is going to be at 50% discount and it's 3-week vesting. And I'm like, how many weeks vesting? Like 3 weeks? What is that? And it's basically just a pure scam. Like, it's basically just to say, tweet about this and then you can dump on people's heads. And like just doing more Web 2 stuff, ironically, and not reinventing the wheel, I think would go a long way. Like, actually have normal vesting periods. If the founders are selling $1 billion in secondaries by the time you get to Series B, like, there's some problems there. That probably does happen in Web 2 as well, but Web 3, it's always like very money-oriented people. So I don't really know how to fix it, but what I would say is it needs to be a holistic solution from the VCs to the founders to the community.
Cool. Well, thanks for sharing, and thank you so much for coming on the pod, Mert. I'm glad we were able to, we had to cut it a little bit short because it means we can do another one and have a lot more stuff to talk about.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for having me.